joining us for a keynote address on Where There's Smoke, There's Fire, Cox's insights into a changing auto market. Please welcome Chief Strategy Officer at Cox Automotive, Jonathan Smoke.
Good morning, everyone. Following that panel, it was tough to keep up, but my role here is to shed some insights that we're following at Cox Automotive. Many of you probably don't know who Cox Automotive is, but I'm sure you have touched us or have some way been connected to us. We're the largest service provider to the automotive industry, which means we basically do everything but make cars. And thank God, with a lot of the content I'll share with you today, manufacturing is the one thing that, as a strategist, I wouldn't want to be doing at this moment. But if you're a consumer, you've probably gone to Kelley Blue Book to look up the value of your vehicle or a vehicle you're researching to purchase. You may have used AutoTrader to find that vehicle and buy that vehicle and connect with a dealer. If you've gone to a dealer, chances are the software they use it comes from us, and in fact, the dealer is our largest collective customer. And then we own Manheim because the vehicle market in the U.S. is 70% used, and about half of those used vehicles in retail come through our Manheim auto auctions. And as a result, we have a real-time view of what values and what's really happening. So my job as strategist is to gather all the facts and plan for the future. And so this is a really interesting time to do that very thing. And I'll have to share with you, I'm a recovering economist, so you're going to see some of the facts kind of skew in that direction to think about the macro context, but also the microeconomics that drive transportation decisions that are very, very relevant. But to start things off, I just want to cover that we are in the midst of a massive radical change scenario, and that's especially true for the automotive industry, but I would argue most industries in the U.S. Because of this confluence of trends that are happening. I've put them into three buckets here overall, but I think of it actually as a giant bubbling cauldron, of which what's been put into that cauldron is not all necessarily negative, but some of it definitively is or is more challenging, especially for the automotive market. First of all, we have a significant affordability constraints. The industry was moving towards more expensive vehicles in part because of the way that last panel ended, focusing on the cost of labor in the U.S. We have inevitably gone down a path before the pandemic and the supply chain crisis that new vehicles were increasingly becoming more expensive and becoming only the domain of the top two income quintiles in the country. We've also gone through a radical shift in supply-demand dynamics that the industry has been consistently undersupplied or optimally supplied, which is a big shift from what occurred in the decades leading to the pandemic. And as a result, dependence on discounting, dependence on incentives are gone. And then if you look across what impacts the consumer, it's not just the cost of a new vehicle, it's also the cost of a used vehicle, it is the cost of parts and repair and maintenance, and also the cost of insurance. So ownership costs are increasingly becoming more challenging. And I would argue from a policy perspective, we are a country that is dependent on personal transportation, and yet the ownership of a personal vehicle is becoming increasingly challenging. Then we have a bucket of policy volatility, and that's really where it's been challenging for manufacturers, particularly because we've had a total change in the last year. Of course, we had tariffs that were added to steel and aluminum as significant inputs, but then to imported vehicles and parts. There is no vehicle assembled in the U.S. that's immune from the parts. And then almost half of the vehicles that we sell in the U.S. are imported, leading to what we estimate was about a $30 billion burden that was added to manufacturers and suppliers last year. Not all of that was pushed onto consumers because bucket A is affordability and there's only so much room, but there's also, this is an industry that on average takes 4 to 5 years to plan the supply chain and the factory tooling in order to launch a new vehicle. So when there are changes, you don't see immediate changes in the US. But I would highlight for you that one policy question mark that is a huge one on the auto industry is the resolution of the USMCA. Where is that going to head? And a lot of manufacturers have essentially hesitated on making major new investments in factories in the US as they await to find what comes of that. And then, of course, we're in the midst of a giant technology change. We heard a lot about that from the last panel, and I'll dig into that more with some of the detail I tell you. Here's where the recovering economists come in. If you look at where we are in April of this year, the consumer has once again held up to be incredibly resilient. And some of that has been the factor of, even though we have had a significant surge in the price of gasoline and oil since the conflict in Iran has kicked off, we were in the midst of receiving the largest tax refunds in history. And so far the math has worked out that a little bit more was on the tax refund side going into people's pockets than what they've had to spend at the gas pump. But if that continues, we risk that the second half of the year could be more challenging. We certainly see it reflected in negative trends like interest rates have gone up rather than down, and we've been seeing auto loan rates that have not gone back to pre-pandemic levels. Of course, the impact at the pump has made consumers more sour about the future, but thankfully on the demand side, you have the tax refunds. Credit actually modestly loosened because lenders are fine if they receive the rates that they're getting to cover the risk of those loans. And the labor market is full of questions we don't have time to dig in today, but happy to chat with anyone about that. But so far, just like the spending has remarkably held up. It's really in the policy changes that you create a massive amount of uncertainty that is really tough to handle in an industry on the new vehicle side that is driven by 4 to 5 year product decisions. The tariffs, of course, are a big piece of that, and I've mentioned the $30 billion burden that is there. It is inevitable that those costs will be more shared. We're already seeing manufacturers push more costs through what they charge dealers so that the dealers are paying some of that effect. And we're seeing changes like you see in the grocery store with shrinkflation. Vehicles that once had this included feature no longer have that feature as manufacturers try to deal with the added costs. We've also had an enormous change on the EV front that was also discussed by the panel. That is playing itself out, I would argue, in 2026 with the decline in production of many electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. You still have some incentives that manufacturers are receiving through this year. But we are seeing changes in their product plans and their launches. But I would argue the biggest change was the end of essentially most of the regulations that were driving the product planning from manufacturers, and principally that dealing with emissions and dealing with fuel economy standards. In essence, the fetters are off and the industry is allowed to produce whatever they want, which inevitably leads to larger, more expensive vehicles and further worsens the affordability challenge. It also really puts a challenge on any manufacturer who is trying to serve the US market, whether they're based here or not, as well as support a global platform that addresses the regulatory and other requirements that happen around the world. And uncertainty is certainly a major part of this, and as I mentioned with USMCA, we're not done. So that feeds into our outlook for this year. This is our outlook that actually hasn't changed over the last couple of months because we are essentially right in line with our expectations for the year. If April comes in as we're expecting with about a 16 million SAR, we will end up this year with about 15.8 million new vehicles being sold. We have constraints on the new vehicle market on the supply side because manufacturers are reducing imports that no longer make sense because especially more affordable vehicles that were imported with the tariffs added to them, they no longer make sense to the consumer. They're priced out of that consumer's market. But then also the dialing back of EVs that I'll show you the forecast for that too, leads to a reduction in supply, reduction in delivery. And so far, that's exactly what we're seeing in the inventory and supply numbers. Fleet, we expect, is going to hold up a bit more. Fleet is a little bit more resilient to the affordability challenge and had largely recovered its pre-spending. And longer term, we expect more growth in fleet, in part because of trends like autonomous that was discussed by the prior panel is likely to result there. But of course, the topic, and I think a lot of the political headlines are about the EV transition dying. No, the EV transition is still fully alive. It's just shifted and has become a little bit more laissez-faire than the direction that we were seeing before. And some interesting stats to share with you revolve around the fact that consumers actually love their EVs. We basically see in surveys like from McKinsey that in the US, only about 9% of people who have owned an EV plan to change their powertrain in their next purchase, meaning they're very loyal. We see data from J.D. Power that indicates last year was the highest satisfaction ever with EVs, with a proliferation of models that's across multiple brands. It's not a one-trick pony with Tesla anymore. And you really see from their data that if you own an EV, 96% of the people who bought EVs last year intend to stick with an EV into the future. So we've reached a bit of a tipping point, and I would argue with the trends that we're seeing in the market today, especially in the used market, you're going to see more of that as EVs become less of a political issue and more of a personal decision that in circumstances for many people is the right decision. So we're seeing the adjustment in the new vehicle market. New vehicle EV sales in the first quarter were down 28% year over year. That's not a surprise given also the boost related to the tariff announcements in March of last year. It's the used vehicle market that I would argue you need to pay attention to because the massive amount of new vehicles sold over the last several years were majority leased, which means they're coming back this year, next year, and in 2028, feeding the used retail market, and consumers are gobbling them up in the used retail market. You also may have heard that the fleet customers have pulled back, and indeed, when we dig into fleet sales, we had the largest EV concentration in fleets back in 2023, when the clean vehicle credit was in force, and also when the rental car companies, particularly Hertz, high profile, went long on Teslas and then had issues with that in the rental car market and substantially pulled back. But what you see in the data is that the customers who really have use cases, which are largely commercial customers, they're consistently buying the same amount of EVs and continue to plan so in the future, and we think that's likely to continue to be the case. On the pricing side and the supply side, and as a recovering economist, I'll tell you, if I only had one indicator in the world, days supply would be the indicator that I would look at. And we see encouraging signals from that suggest that indeed in the new vehicle market, we have a balance that's being achieved, that EVs are essentially in balance with the rest of the market at a level that we would consider normal. We still don't have full price parity, but we're moving in that direction and believe within a few years we'll be there. On the used vehicle side, that demand for used EVs is stronger than the demand for the rest of the market, and we're only a $1,000 difference in comparable vehicles with the average used EVs being sold. So it's the democratization. So when you look to the future, what do we see? Well, we do see a pullback in EVs in the short term, in volumes and in share for this calendar year versus last year. But because hybrids are growing, we're actually seeing the continued decline of ICE vehicles. And although our forecasts have been steadily revised about what that penetration arc is going to look like in the light vehicle market or the medium and heavy market, it's still one that's up and to the right over time. It's just taking time. And honestly, I think that's right for the US economy. But the biggest story, I think, is autonomous. The last panel talked about this quite a bit, but I just want to reinforce that robotaxis are not some future event. They're very real and happening now. We've seen a 10x increase in Waymo rides to 500,000 per month as of March. They're operating in 10 cities and have multiple more cities planned. They're not the only player, and this platform is dependent on being fully electric. So in conclusion, where are we and what keeps me up at night? Well, the macro situation is not sustainable if the price of oil remains above $100 as it is with Brent crude. At some point, the consumer is not going to have those tax refunds this year, keeping their spending alive, and that potentially is a risk for the US economy. Those policy changes have yet to fully reach the consumer. Pay attention to what manufacturers do in the second half of the year, especially if we have some closure or more certainty related to the future of USMCA. And then finally, don't buy the hype that EVs are dead. Pay attention to the used vehicle market, because more average Americans are going to be exposed to the technology and where it makes sense. We have 5.5 million EVs in the car park today, but we believe there's potential for 60 to 65 million over time as the prices reach and the opportunity to reach those consumers. And don't forget about those Waymos and other robo-taxis that depend on electrification. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Hope those facts help keep you informed about what's going on in the auto industry.